Dzień dobry. Wybiła 16, więc
Good afternoon,
proszę pozwolić,
ladies and
że
gentlemen.
teraz
It's
rozpoczniemy
4
naszą
p.m., so
sesję.
let me start our
Nazywam
session.
się
My
Alicja
name
Wójcik,
is
jestem
Alicia
nauczycielem
Wójcik,
języka
and I have the
polskiego-polskiego
pleasure to
na pierwszej w
welcome
tym
you
roku
to the first
sesji
this year
edukacyjnej online.
educational session,
Nasza
which is being
sesja
held
będzie
online. Our
tłumaczona
session
symultanicznie na
will be
język
translated,
angielski
interpreted
i
into
tą
the English
techniką,
language
która umożliwi
simultaneously.
Państwu skorzystanie
So
z
if you
języka
would like to
angielskiego,
take
widzicie w dolnej
advantage of that,
części
please have a look
ekranu
at
po
the
prawej
bottom
stronie to jest taka ikonka
at the bottom
przypominająca
corner on
globus.
the
Gdybyście
right, you can
Państwo
see a
nie widzieli,
globe
to bardzo proszę wejść
picture. If you
w
don't see it,
ikonkę,
please
napisać
enter the
więcej i
icon
tam
which
powinno
says
być
more,
dostępne
and there you can
tłumaczenie
find this
symultaniczne.
simultaneous interpretation
Drodzy
option.
Państwo,
Ladies and
niemalże
gentlemen,
równo miesiąc temu,
1
27
month ago, on
stycznia,
27th of
na
January
terenie
2025,
zapadnicy
on the
Auschwitz
territory of
odbyła się
Auschwitz,
uroczystość upamiętniająca
um,
80-lecie
a
wyzwolenia
celebration of 17th of
kar
anniversary of
Auschwitz.
liberation of
Dzisiaj w
Auschwitz
trakcie
took place. So
sesji
today, during
zatytułowanej
this session
Początki
entitled "The
funkcjonowania miejsc
Beginnings of
pamięci
the Functioning of the
Auschwitz,
Auschwitz Memorial",
będziemy
we
rozmawiać
are
o
going
tym,
to
co
talk
działo się
about
na
what actually
terenach byłego
happened
obozu
in the location
ogólnowego
of the
wyzwolenia, czyli od
former
27
place of
stycznia
extermination
1945
between
roku, czyli do
1945
momentu
until
otwarcia, powołania do
the
życia
opening
Muzeum, Państwowego
of
Muzeum
the
Auschwitz-Birkenau,
National
które
Museum
wtedy w
Auschwitz-Birkenau,
momencie
National
powołania
Museum, State Museum, because
miało
back
po nieco
then
inną nazwę.
it
O
had a
tych
different
2
name. We
latach,
are
o
going
tym,
to
co
talk
działo
about
się
it. So we're going to talk about these 2 years
na których
between
znajdują się miejsca
1945 and
pamięci, o
1947.
tym, jakie były reakcje
We are
miejscowej
going to talk
ludności na to, co tutaj się
about
działo
reactions
na
of the local
pozostałości
population
po
regarding
obozowe.
of what was happening,
Opowiedzą
or of the remainings, remnants
biologowie,
of this
doktorzy z Centrum
place.
Badań Państwowego
And we're going to
Muzeum
listen to the
Auschwitz-Birkenau
doctors
jako
from
pierwszy
the
speech będzie
Auschwitz-Birkenau
wygłosił
State Museum.
dr
And the first
Jacek
speech will be
Lachendro.
given by Dr.
W
Jacek
następnie po
Lachendro.
krótkiej przerwie
And then after a
dr
short
Piotr
break,
Setkiewicz.
we will also listen to the
Niestety
speech
nie
by
będziemy
Dr. Piotr
mogli opowiedzieć
Setkiewicz.
dzisiaj Państwu
Unfortunately,
o
we'll
początkach
not be able to talk
przeprowadzania
about
wstępnego
the
Muzeum
beginnings of the
Auschwitz-Birkenau.
mm,
Niestety z przyczyn
all the
losowych
information
pierwszy
because
zaplanowany
of
do tematu
certain
panelista nie może
reasons.
wziąć
One of the
udziału w dzisiejszej
panelists
sesji.
would
Znaleźliśmy
could
kolejną
not
osobę, która
take
jednak
part in
również
the session. We found
no
another
niestety
person
nie
in
mogła, ma
replacement.
wysypał
However,
chorobowy
this person
i
could
to
not
nas pokonało.
be here
Także wysłuchajcie
either
Państwo
because of
dwóch
health
panów.
issues. So we're going to listen to two
Zapraszam już teraz
lectures
pana doktora
altogether. So let
Jacka
me just
Lachendro
invite Mr.
z
Dr.
Centrum
Jacek
Badań Państwowego
Lachendro
Muzeum
from
Auschwitz-Birkenau.
the
Pan doktor
Auschwitz-Birkenau,
będzie nam przedstawić
Auschwitz,
właśnie sytuację na terenach byłego
State Museum, and he's going to
kar
talk about the
Auschwitz
situation
od
in
27
this
stycznia
place
1945 roku
between January
do 2
27th,
lipca
1945 to
1948.
July 2nd,
Panie doktorze,
1947.
bardzo
Doctor,
proszę.
the screen is yours, so
Dziękuję
please.
bardzo za
Thank you so
zaproszenie do
much
udziału w
for
tym
inviting me to take part
dzisiejszym
in this
spotkaniu.
webinar.
Temat już mojego
So the subject of
wystąpienia
my
został
presentation, of my
przedstawiony.
lecture, has
Ja
already
tylko
been
chciałem na samym
mentioned. So let me
początku
just
przeprosić za mój głos, bo
say
od
sorry
pewnego
for my
od paru dni
voice
mam
because for
problemy
several days I've
ze
been
strunami
struggling
głosowymi,
with
czyli
my vocal
siadło na
cords,
nich i
and
no, mam nadzieję,
I may
że
not be heard
bez
well, but I
problemów
hope that
ten
you will be
wykład
able
Państwu
to
przedstawię
listen to me
bez
and hear me
jakichś
clearly
wtrącań
without any like coughing or other
hasłania.
stuff
Temat
like this. So the subject
mojego wystąpienia,
of
tutaj Państwo
my
widzą już na
lecture, you can see
ekranie,
actually it on the
od
screen
wyzwolenia
already,
został
from
przedstawiony
liberation
od wyzwolenia
um,
KL Auschwitz do
of
utworzenia Państwowego
Auschwitz
Muzeum
concentration
w
camp to
Oświęcimiu,
the
ponieważ ta
establishment of the
nazwa
State Museum
najczęściej
in
była,
Oświęcim, because
dla
that
tej
was the
placówki
name
najczęściej
which
była
used to be
początkowo używana.
used at the beginning of its
Te
functioning.
ramy
That's why I
chronologiczne
put it
to
here. So regarding
21
the
stycznia
chronology,
1945
we want
i
to focus
czerwiec
on
i lipiec
actually 2 years between 1945, which was January
1947.
27th,
Niemniej,
and
żeby
July 7th, 1947, 2 years.
wyjaśnić
But to
pewne
explain certain
wydarzenia czy pewne
events or
zjawiska
certain
na terenie
phenomena that took
byłego obozu,
place
a później już
in this
stworzonego
former
muzeum,
camp and then
chciałem
museum,
cofnąć się
I would
kilka
like to go
miesięcy
back
wstecz
several months
i
before
przedstawić Państwu
and introduce the most important events that took place in the camp in the second half of 1945. Here you can see an aerial picture by aliens, the Allies in 1944, and it will make it easier for me to present certain facts. Well, the German concentration camp called Auschwitz and then extermination camp. As you know, it was established in spring 1940, and in the subsequent years, it was expanded. It was extended, and in 1944, in summer, it actually became most popular, and I would say popular. I would say became developed. And in this photo, you can see three major parts of the camp. The main camp with this big background where you had storage facilities, two factories where people were prisoners were forced to work. So 2 kilometers to the west, around 2 kilometers to the west from the main camp, there was even bigger camp complex, which was called Birkenau, and for 6 kilometers to the east, there was a Auschwitz camp. And apart from these three basic parts, the complex also consisted almost 40 sub-camps. So according to the Polish resistance movement from 21st of August 1944, during this time, in the camp, there were around 105,000 prisoners, registered prisoners. The majority of them were Jews, because I would say over 70,000, Poles around 19,000, and Soviet people around 9,000, and 6.5 thousand. These were prisoners of different nations, other nations. Apart from this, there were also deposit temporary camps in the Birkenau camp, and there were also around 300,000 people, Jews, that were not registered in the camp. So they were transferred gradually, step by step, in subsequent weeks to different camps in the territory of the Third Reich and the central camps, I would say. So at the same time, well, the camp became really developed. Hundreds of kilometers to the west, the Red Army was doing its military activities, actions, and as a result of these actions, the front line stopped around the Baltic line up to Carpathy Mountains and further toward the Slovakia and Hungary. Here, what's most important for us and interesting for us is this middle part and southern eastern part of Poland, because here the front line at the end of August 1944 stopped more or less around between Vistula River and Wisłoka River. And here, this front line at Wisłoka River, well, there was, it actually was somewhere around 2 kilometers from the camp complex in Auschwitz. And apart from these military activities, the soldiers of the Red Army took also Majdanek into their control around Lublin. And as a consequence, they discovered certain evidence of murders, and they also captured SS men. So all these events, sort of, changing the front line closer to the camp, the Auschwitz camp, and also entering the Karl Lublin location territory and discovering these events, these murders. And well, led to a situation where the authorities decided to transfer the prisoners from Auschwitz to different concentration camps located somewhere like deeper in the Reich, further from this front line that I mentioned before. And as a consequence, in the second part of 1944, these other camps in the Reich, around 65,000 prisoners were actually transferred there, consequently, and at the same time, there were more and more transports coming to Auschwitz still from Litzmannstadt ghetto, for example, or also Poles from the Warsaw Uprising, and then Jews from Slovakia and Terezinstadt and Morawy. As a consequence, some prisoners were taken out of the camps and transferred into different camps, and the other way around. Some prisoners were transferred into the camps. So at this point, there were around over 60,000 prisoners there. In the majority of cases, these were Jews. So under the influence of the successes of the Red Army, I mean, the thing that they discovered all these murders that took place there, well, they tried to remove the traces, the evidence of these murders in the Auschwitz camp. So first, they burned all the documents that could, confirm that something like that had happened. For example, documents regarding transportation of prisoners outside or into this camp. And once they stopped the extermination of Jews at the beginning of November 1944, then the authorities decided to deassemble the equipment installations in the crematoria in the gas chamber 2 and 3, numbers 2 and 3. They disassembled, that they demolished, I would say, the crematorium number 4 of the gas chamber, number 4, which had been destroyed before during the uprising by Sonderkommando, and then they left only crematorium 5. And at the end of 1944, with the hands of the prisoners, obviously, the authorities of the camp decided to remove the ashes of the places where they were stored. And during this time, they were also trying to remove all the property that was deported there, that was stored there, and they were the property of Jews. For some reason, for some chaos, because there was certain chaos going on, I mean, the SS men in January especially, because they were rushing back then there was another offense that I'm going to mention in a minute. But let me come back. There were a lot of traces of murders that happened in this location, and a lot of property was deported outside the camp as well. But some of them was left in the camp. So let me refer to this property, to these traces of this evidence of murders later during my presentation. On the 12th of January 1945, the Red Army started its another offensive, which was quite crucial. And again, the Vistula River, the central lines in Poland, this is where the Red Army started attacking the German units. And the goal of this operation was to destroy the German units in the central and eastern part of Poland and to get to the Odra River and get there certain locations and then prepare for next actions to actually get to Berlin. And in the southern part of Poland, the operations were being conducted by the first Ukrainian front. The front, in this terminology, it means that was a group of people, army, I would say, in other words. And the goal of this, you can see it actually here. This is the line on the map. You can see there were Ukrainian soldiers over there, and the goal of these activities, of these actions in the northern part of the Ukrainian front was to get to the Odra River, especially to Wrocław city. And in the southern part, the goal was to get to the upper part of Silesia and control the whole industrial region in the upper part of Silesia. So once the Red Army, especially two armies in the first front of Ukrainians, 1659 ones, when they entered Krakow, then the SS authorities decided to evacuate and then liquidate the camp, the Auschwitz camp. Between 17th and 21st of January, they forced 56,000 of prisoners to walk, and the majority of them were taken, or they were walking, I would say, through different railway roads far away from the camp. It was, I would say, like 50, 60 kilometers from the camp. They had to get to the railway station in Władysław Śląski and Gliwice cities, and from there, they were supposed to be transported further by railway, by the train. And so this march, well, apart from that, let me say something more. The prisoners, like dozens of thousands of them, some of them were also walking different roads. But during these marches, a lot of people died. In the Upper Silesian Opolskie province, I would say that around 3,000 prisoners died, and during the whole evacuation process. So also in transportation, right, on the train, and then further, because they were transported through Czech Republic, through Morava, and then deeper into Germany. So altogether, at least 9,000 prisoners, people died. So that's a picture that you can see painted by Mr. Pochnowski in 1946. And here he illustrated how this march looked, what it looked like, because he was actually a witness to this march. He could see these people, these prisoners. Well, regarding the camp, there were some people left over there during this time, around 9,000, almost 9,000 prisoners were left there. They were still living there. So after the evacuation of the majority of prisoners, the SS men did not really watch the remaining prisoners. So those who were still in the camp, they were kind of controlled by, let's say, flying patrols of SS men who were still there. They were kind of controlling the remaining prisoners. And from time to time, they would come there and see what was happening, what was going on, whether it's Birkenau, Monowitz, or any other camp. They were just looking at the prisoners and checking if anyone wanted to escape the camp. At the same time, some SS men who were still there in the camp, they started certain activities, the goal of which was to destroy, to, let's say, remove the traces of this murder. So on the 20th of January, there was a small group of SS men that put bomb under the buildings. I mean, the gas chambers, crematorium number 2 and 3. And on the 26th of January, they put a bomb, crematorium number 5, and all of these buildings actually exploded. So here you can see the remnants of these buildings after explosion. It happened very shortly after the evacuation. In the first picture above, you can see crematorium number 2, below crematorium number 3, and and then some remnants of crematorium number 5. So SS-men, they were not actually able to take out all the things, all the property that was robbed, actually that was taken from the prisoners that were actually deported. So what they did, they wanted to burn all these facilities, the storage houses that were in the western part in the Birkenau camp. And these storage facilities, of course, contained all this property of the prisoners. So all of this stuff actually was destroyed. So it's a series of different pictures, chronic, I would say, regarding, the evacuation, because that's a movie actually that was made very shortly after the evacuation. And here are some snapshots of this movie, of this video, and you can see this burned barracks, burned storage facilities that were called Canada 2.
So prisoners that remained here were still waiting for the Red Army to come. It was obvious that the Soviet soldiers are coming from the east, and there were more and more signs. Cannons were heard. And in fact, the Red Army was conducting its military operations here. And as I said before, the main target in this area was to capture the Upper Silesia. And after capturing Krakow on the 19th of January, the units of the 60th Army went to the west, and the purpose of this army was to invade Upper Silesia from the south, and on the route, on the way, the soldiers of the 60th Army came across Auschwitz camp, the whole compound. The Soviet soldiers came to the outskirts of Oświęcim on the 26th of January, and then the next day they entered Manowitz camp, and they liberated around 600 prisoners. That was before noon on the 27th of January. And then in the afternoon, after 3 o'clock, around 3:30, they entered the area of Birkenau camp and the main camp as well. At that time, there were no pictures taken, so the only material that we can use to illustrate what this meeting of the liberated prisoners with these Red Army soldiers could look like are the illustrations made by a Soviet soldiers of Jewish origin, Zenovi Tokachev, who shortly after the liberation came to the former campgrounds. He was a talented artist. He talked to the prisoners. He listened to their stories, and he drew pictures to illustrate the stories he heard, the testimonies he heard, including the events during the liberation. So that's one of his pictures called The Liberator. So what has to be underlined here is that from the perspective of the prisoners, the entry of the Soviet soldiers to the camp was in fact a liberation. I'm not going to talk about the behavior of Soviet soldiers outside the camp, because I think Piotr Setkiewicz will talk about it during the next presentation, but on the campgrounds, they were received as liberators, as saviors, actually. So what's interesting here is that for a number of years, first the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation kept saying that the Russians and the Russian soldiers liberated prisoners of the Auschwitz camp. So we have an interesting document here. attached to a document or material from the Defense Ministry of the Russian Federation. And this document is a report about the number of soldiers, officers, based on their social and demographic features. So soldiers and officers from 60th Army, that status at the beginning of January 1945. So as I said, the beginning of January 1945. So the 60th Army included two divisions that liberated the prisoners of Auschwitz, number 100 and number 302. So what is important here in this document, especially the reverse side of this document, where we have numbers corresponding to the nationality of officers and soldiers from the non-commissioned officers of the 60th Army. And most of those who served on this army were Russian. We have a summary information here, over 42,000. And the second biggest group were Ukrainians, slightly over 38,000. So the difference between the Russians and the Ukrainians is not that big. So we can assume that in division 100 and the division 302 at that time not only included Russians, but also Ukrainians. And Ukrainian soldiers can also be recognized as the liberators of the Auschwitz prisoners. Soviet soldiers liberated in those three parts of the camp I mentioned at the beginning. I mean, the main camp, Birkenau and Monowitz, they liberated in total around 7,000 prisoners, plus around 500 in a number of sub-camps from which they were not evacuated. So when it comes to the three main parts, as I said, the liberation took place on the 27th of January. And as for the sub-camps, for example, Neudax in Jaworzno, there the prisoners were liberated on the 19th of January. But in Jawiszowiec, they had to wait longer for the Soviet soldiers, and they were liberated in the morning on the 29th of January. So majority of the prisoners, which were here in the camp grounds or the remains of the camp, were sick, exhausted, unable to walk. Only some of them had enough strength, as we can see here in the picture, and those who were still in a relatively good physical condition started leaving the area of the former camp. However, as I said, most of the prisoners were sick and exhausted, and it was necessary to get help for them as soon as possible. So after a few days, the Soviet military authorities organized field hospitals. So around February 1st, the field hospitals were separated from the Soviet divisions and assigned to the former Auschwitz camp. And from February 6th, a Polish Red Cross hospital also started operating, and volunteers of the Polish Red Cross from Krakow came, doctors, nurses, and they started setting up another hospital here. So from the first days of February, the former main camp, some of its blocks were adapted into hospitals, as I said. So, well, this is very useful for me to show some facts or phenomena related to the history of the camp and the history of this place after liberation. So For information, we have the gate with the Arbeit macht frei motto, and then we have hospitals where volunteers of the Polish Red Cross works, and the Soviet hospitals, field hospitals, were organized in several blocks in the part on the right from the Arbeit gate. So block 9, 10, block 16, 17, 20, 21. And here we have a picture of the medical personnel of one of those hospitals, because in the following months, the hospitals and the personnel were changing. So we have the head of one of the hospital, Major Margarita Zhinskaya, and on the other picture, we have the personnel of the Polish Red Cross and the director of the Polish Red Cross Hospital, Józef Belet, in the dark suit in the middle. So the personnel of the Soviet hospitals and the Polish hospitals started cooperating with each other, and the medical personnel took care of over 4,500 prisoners. So, as I said, they were located gradually, well, they were transferred from Birkenau and Monowitz, and they were located in the blocks that I've just mentioned, and they were treated. So that's one of the pictures made in one of the hospital rooms, where on both sides of the aisle we can see patients, so former female prisoners and some medical personnel and Red Cross nurses and sisters from Oświęcim who are also helping the prisoners. So the vast majority of the survivors suffered from extreme exhaustion. And here you can see what one of the prisoners, female prisoners, looked like, who spent just a few months in the camp. She was brought there in the second part of 1944. So it was mainly due to the problems with diarrhea, and the digestive system of the body was so destroyed and damaged that whatever most of those people ate, their bodies got rid of it immediately, and that's why they suffered from loss of muscles, their lost weight, and most of the survivors, adult survivors, had the weight of 35 kilograms. Additionally, they had skin problems. The skin was dry, earthy color. And apart from the former prisoners who suffered from the exhaustion of their bodies, there were also people with conditions of upper respiratory tracts or suffering from wounds. They had pus problems, and in a number of cases, surgeries were necessary to help them. Hospitals, the Soviet hospitals, operated in the former main camp until summer 1945, and the Polish Red Cross Hospital operated until the end of September 1945. And in those hospitals, around 500 former prisoners died. However, on the other hand, we can say that around 4,000 or slightly over 4,000 were brought back to strength, to good conditions, and they were able to go home. So right after the liberation in the area of the former main camp and in the area of Birkenau, there were over 600 bodies of prisoners who died there before the Soviet army came. So they were deliberately killed by the SS officers. So first, the bodies from the main camp were stored in Block 11, and here we can see the bodies of the last victims in Block 11, and the bodies of Birkenau prisoners were collected. They were in a few barracks and between the barracks, and they were collected and transferred to ditches at the back of the camp. And here we can see the spot. Hopefully you can see it. We're close to the ruins of crematorium number 3, where a few ditches were dug out, and initially all the bodies were put there. And finally, on the 28th of February 1945, those bodies from Birkenau and the bodies from Block 11 were transferred close to the former main camp in a funeral ceremony. So that's a funeral picture where we can see local residents who were carrying coffins on their shoulders, coffins with the last victims of Birkenau. So they walked over 2 kilometers along this road from a B1 sector in the direction of the railway, and then to the place marked with number 5. And there was a big ditch dug out where the coffins with the bodies brought from Birkenau were put. There was also a smaller grave for bodies from Block 11. And on the following days and weeks, in bodies of those people who died in the hospital of the Polish Red Cross or the Soviet hospitals were also buried in smaller graves. So I mean those 500 people more or less that I mentioned earlier. And here we have some pictures taken during the funeral ceremonies and the burial. The coffins were put in this mass grave, and we can also see a picture of some officials from the Soviet army, local authority representatives. And after some time, on this plaque, there was some information that the last victims of the Nazi murderers are buried here. I think that was this plaque was the first attempt to commemorate the victims of the Auschwitz camp. And with time, this place was transformed into a small graveyard. And here we can see a picture of this graveyard taken a few years ago with a commemorative plaque informing that this is the burial site of the former prisoners who died there before the Soviet army came. And what I wanted to underline here is that from the very first minutes when after the Soviet soldiers entered the camp, the main camp and the Birkenau was under a strict control of the Red Army and the military authorities. I will go back to this soon, but first I would like to give you some more information about the operations of the investigation committee, whose task was to collect the evidence of crimes committed by the Nazis. And the name of this committee was very long, It was an extraordinary state commission of the Soviet Union for investigating Nazi crimes. So members of this commissions included lawyers, doctors, but also two Polish people, residents of Oświęcim. One was a former prisoner, and they made an on-site inspection. They described in detail a lot of places which they investigated. They also secured 7 tons of hair that was cut from the victims of the mass extermination in gas chambers. And here you can see one of the members of this committee. I think that's one of the residents of Oświęcim who is actually looking at this enormous amount of hair. Some of the hair is in bags. Some has been taken out of the bags. So they also secured a huge number of property that was previously stolen from the deported Jews. Only part of this property was kept in the barracks and in those storage buildings, the so-called Canada II, as I mentioned earlier, which were then burned by the SS officers. So some of the property was kept in other places in the former camp, and this is where the members of this committee secured that. So they treated this property, this enormous amount of property, as an evidence of a mass crime committed here. They also secured a lot of documents. Some of those documents were looted to or stolen from another Polish committee, but I will come back to this later. They also interrogated a lot of witnesses. They prepared a lot of picture, photographic documentation, and the conclusions of the investigations were then published in form of an announcement in May 1945. That's a picture showing members of this committee taken in the headquarters in their room of the Rudolf Hess commander. And here you can see a part of this announcement published on the May 7th, 1945 in Pravda Daily. The title is About Atrocities of the German Government in Auschwitz. And there, in this announcement, based on the material collected, there is information about the origins of the plant, how it operated, how the prisoners functioned there, how they worked there. There is information about experiments. And what's interesting, when there was mention of people deported to the camp or victims of the camp, no nationalities were mentioned, only countries from which those people came. So this information also mentioned information about people deported from Austria, France, Soviet Union, Poland, but there was no mention that there were Jews among those people. And one of the most important conclusions of this committee was the number of victims, 4 million, which was widespread in the among Polish society, Soviet society, and it became a symbol of the crime, the German crimes. And although after several dozen years, my colleagues from the museum, the historians who received all sort of documents from Western Europe were aware that this number is not really accurate. It's too big. It was not possible to change it during the communist rule in Poland because that was a symbol of the crime made here by the Germans and used in the propaganda fight against the German Federal Republic. And only after the political transformation in Poland, the former head of the scientific center, Franciszek Pieper, following research, reduced this number to 1,300,000 people deported to Auschwitz. And he also indicated the nationalities of people deported here. So the biggest number, 1,100,000, were Jews, Polish people, over 140,000, then Roma people, Soviet prisoners, and prisoners of other nationalities. So this committee ended its work by this announcement made on May 7th, 1945, and in April, in Krakow, a commission for investigating Nazi and German crimes in Auschwitz was launched. There was a site visit made to the former camp, and the operation of this committee were very soon replaced by the employees of the Krakow unit for the Commission of Investigating German Crimes in Poland. So that's a picture of the head of the Krakow unit, Jan Zen, this gentleman on the right in the hat, and this committee had really great achievements. Similarly to the Soviet committee, they made site visits, they described a lot of places, a very detailed documentation with a lot of pictures was prepared, a lot of witnesses were interviewed, and members of those committees also sent samples of hair to forensic institutes, and as part of those tests, it came out that the basic element of cyclone B is present in the hair. As I said, the former prisoners were interrogated. That's an interesting picture of one of the people who made a testimony in the left top corner. He was a prisoner of Sonderkommando, but before he was forced to work in crematorium number 1. And here we can see how bodies of the prisoners were put on those special trolleys to then slide them into the crematoria furnaces number 1. As I said, the committee prepared a very detailed documentation with a lot of photographs. They managed to photograph elements of the installations from gas chambers and crematoria, which were dismantled at the end of 1945, prepared for evacuation, but Germans did not manage to take them away with them. So they were actually on the grounds of the main camp waiting for transport. So as I said, the Germans did not take those elements away. That's a part of a lift from crematorium number 2 or 3. This lift was used for transporting bodies from the level of a gas chamber to the level of the furnaces, and at the bottom we have pipes from the ventilation system from one of the 2 crematoria, and here we have the pokes used by Sonderkommando prisoners to push bodies inside the furnaces in crematoria. We can also see barrels for the transport of ashes and the grates from the crematoria furnaces.
These pictures are really valuable because the members of the commission worked in the territory of the camp for several weeks in May. At the beginning of June, the Soviet authorities, as I said before, they would control the whole territory of the former camp. They forbidden any type of work there. So once the members of the commission were able to come back to the former camp, all the things that they had taken pictures of, they were not there anymore. So probably they had been deported with other stuff by the Soviet authorities. Why were they forbidden to work in the main camp? Well, the whole territory of the camp, as you can see here in this plan, it was actually taken over for the German prisoners. So the army, Soviet authorities, they somehow transformed this camp into the German prisoners camp. And before that, they had been there in some part of the camp, obviously. As I said, there were also some hospitals for the former prisoners. But on the 1st June, the prisoners were taken outside the camp to the barracks, and then the whole territory was taken over to create a prisoner camp. And it was also created in sector B1 in Birkenau, and then later also in sector B2A, well, in the former sectors of the Birkenau camp. And here in the main camp, in the former main camp, they would keep the German prisoners that were captivated, and apart from them, civilians arrested by the Soviet in the Upper Silesia part were also taken there. So the civilians and the prisoners, they would undergo certain selections and then transported to labor camps in the Soviet Union. So according to some fragmentary data that we have, we know that altogether over 22,000 men were deported. Among them, around 800 was actually Silesian guys, Silesian people who were forced to work deeper in the Soviet Union. In the summertime, the Soviet authorities freed the majority of civilians and also not the majority, I would say, but some part of the soldiers as well, because they probably thought that they were not good workers. So, and gradually the camps were liquidated. Regarding the main camp, they actually liquidated the camp in 1945, and in Birkenau it was in February 1946. So here you can see several pictures taken by somebody from the Red Cross personnel. And here you can see the German column. And in the background, you can see the villa where Rudolf Christoph lived with his family. And this is the same territory where the German prisoners did some cleaning, worked there. And you can see long plates over there. And there is also a group of German prisoners sitting. You can see the fragment of block number 12 and block 2 and block number 3. Well, the soldiers, while the camps were operational, many facilities would be transformed. For example, in sector 2BA, here you can see the front wall, and there's some picture painted over there with an herb of the Soviet Union. There are some inscriptions on plaques that were usually in the German language, but here actually they were in the Russian language this time. For example, in the first wall, you can see an inscription, a catchphrase, disciplines decides about winning. So this that may shock you, the Soviet soldiers, here you can see the crematorium. I think it's number 1, and there on the the roof, they created a dance floor. And after their work, they would go up there and just have some parties. And some soldiers, unfortunately, would profane the ashes of the bodies that they could find in the Birkenau grounds. And here you can see some soldiers that found the ashes, and now they are looking for using one of the pond they are using and looking for gold. We know that the Soviet soldiers, well, these camps actually were under control, their control. They dismantled and deported different kinds of properties, right? And for example, they dismantled different kinds of equipment, like milking equipment, butcher's equipment here in the building on the left-hand side, or in the kitchen for SS men on the opposite side. So they deported certain equipment, and there's also a factory, Union factory there. They also disassembled all the equipment in this building. Apart from that, we know that they would deport, they would take different building construction materials and some property that had been robbed before, I mean, the property of Jews, they would also take, and some of them was secured. Then they would sell it to the local authorities, for example, construction materials that I mentioned, or they would sell it to the Krakow authorities. And here, that's an interesting picture, a very symbolic photo, I would say, for the story that I was presenting. This is a picture of a gate, an entrance gate to the main camp. If you look closer, you will see that it will lack an inscription, Arbeit macht frei, right? And from two relations, two reports, we know that the Soviet soldiers took this, removed these inscriptions, and I think that they deported that. They wanted to deport it, but one of the Poles, luckily, had a permission to enter this territory. The former prisoner Eugeniusz Nosal, and then back then he was employed in the city hall in Oświęcim, and he probably went there for some construction materials, but he saw that there's no inscription anymore and that it actually is prepared for being deported. So he paid to the ward, he gave him something, probably some bimber, some vodka, Polish vodka, and he took this inscription. This plaque, he hid this somewhere in the hall. So once the museum opened again, then he actually brought this inscription, this plaque back to the museum. So once the Soviet soldiers left the Birkenau territory and the main camp, there was a special institution that was established after the war in Poland and called a temporary state bureau, and they inspected the whole property in the territory. It was treated as a property left by them, but also post-German territory. So they did this inventory. They took the inventory and secured the property, and then they, of course, issued the report. And the main management of this state bureau, they transferred Sector B barracks in Birkenau camp to the Ministry of Construction, of Reconstruction, and the Ministry of Reconstruction would decide about dismantling of all these barracks, demolishing of all these barracks, and then they would transfer all the materials like wood or concrete or whole barracks actually that were quite easy to dismantle, then assemble again to different locations in Poland, especially those locations that suffered most during the war activities. And this dismantling activity started in March 1946. And here you can see, yes, here we can, it was, yes, in March in 1946, correct. And this dismantling activities were quite quick. And here you can see Sector B2 from May 1945. And in this picture, you can see the same sector from July 1946. And you can see that the majority of barracks that were demolished, and there are only some remnants, some remainings in B2A and partly in 2B. And at the end of 1946, they decided to stop dismantling these barracks. And thanks to this decision, now we have some barracks over there, and we can visit them and see them, what they looked like. Here you can see a picture that some of the materials is being prepared to be deported, to be taken away. But during these decisions that were being made, regarding the dismantling activities, the barracks, and so on and so forth. Well, during the decision process, the management authority actually decided to organize a group of people that would, let's say, secure this territory, the camp territory, and establish a museum, which happened in February 1946. And as a result of different discussions between the representatives of the Ministry of Culture and Art and the Polish Association of Former Political Prisoners, a small group, a small team was created, and they came to Oświęcim and they started to organize this security activities to secure actually the camp and then create a museum, establish a museum. So 1 year after the liberation, over 1 year, all these works actually were started. Why over 1 year after? Well, you may think about it. I actually have mentioned that many times. Until the territory was under control of the Red Army, the Polish authorities were not able to do anything about this fact. And even before, in 1945, the representatives of this major commission for investigation of German crimes, they would ask the Warsaw government to secure this territory, but well, they were not able to because they had no power back then. Only over one after when the Soviet Union, Soviet soldiers left, then they could start all these activities. And well, they began when the Soviet soldiers were leaving this territory. And what happened was that certain people, local people activated, they started to be involved in the process. So they were kind of also outside the place. They would come there and help, were looking for different properties, different things. And there was also a press campaign against people that they called diggers, because they would dig holes over there to look for precious things, I would say. So the authorities stopped these activities, and these pictures actually show the equipment taken away by the local police from these diggers that I mentioned, and also some money like watches that were taken away from her because they were used as a evidence during the court proceedings. And as I said before, as a result of these discussions between the Ministry of Culture and Art and the Polish Association of Former Political Prisons, they formed a group. First, it was a group of 4 people, of former prisoners, headed by the guy that you can see here. He's called Tadeusz Wąsowicz. And they came to Oświęcim, and their task was to secure this territory, protect the territory, the property on the territory, and establish a museum. And during 1 year, they employed more people. So in spring 1947, there were over 50 people employed in the museum. In the majority of cases, those were men who were employed as wards, and they received uniforms, military uniforms. They differed from the actual military uniforms because on the collars, they sewed, you could see, some patches of materials with a red triangle that showed that was a symbol of political prisoner. And they also had rifles, and they were really determined. They collaborated with the local police, and in the second half of 1946, they helped the police, and they really stopped this profanation of ashes and stealing of property. What else I wanted to mention, the majority of these 50 employees, over 50 workers employed in the museum were former prisoners of Auschwitz, who on the one hand protected the place, but also took part in establishing the museum. And this place from the very beginning, when the Polish authorities took over it and when information about establishing the museum became more and more spread, well, it got a lot of interest. In the second half of 1946, and more or less in the second half of the year, let's say, until, well, the main camp, part of this main camp, and the Birkenau camp, well, they were visited by 1,000 people. In 47, it was 170,000 visitors. Back then, these numbers were really huge. And they were supposed to be guided toward by several, like thousands of employees, and there were guides for them. So for them, it was a huge, effort. That's why they thought that they had to create the routes, how to prepare this guided tours. So first, you would enter the main camp from the eastern part, like now the employees enter the camp. And they would start the visitation with the instrument up by flight, the one that I mentioned before that was stolen, but then it came back into place. And so the visitors then went to block 11, which was a sort of mausoleum, and there, yes, and that was the first block. Why only this? Well, the employees, the majority of them, they were former prisoners. Then they would describe the history. They would talk about it, but more from their perspective, right? From their experience, which was not sometimes it was criticized. Why only this was shown at the very beginning? Well, because the majority of these objects were not well prepared to accept visitors. And several slides now. This is the entrance to the camp, to the museum, and you can see the plate, the State Museum in Oświęcim. And this name was then, however, formally official. It is a picture of from 1946, okay? And another photo, you can see visitors here at the gate with Arbeitsgehfrei, this original plate. And the visitors were then guided and toured to block 11, as I said before. Why only this? First, because as I said, the majority of objects were not prepared for visitors. Well, they were devastated, damaged in the last weeks of functioning of the museum, of the camp, and then during this prisoner camp for German prisoners. So this is block 25, where you can see that there's no windows, that they're damaged. That's what you could see in the majority of blocks, actually. The doors were damaged, the windows were damaged, there were no installations, or they were damaged, the walls, the floors, scratched. And so gradually, the authorities of the museum, they of course renovated them block by block, step by step. So they came back to normality so that the visitors could go and see the inside of them. However, the costs of such, let's say, renovation for one block was then 450,000 Polish zloty, and the monthly grant from the government was 400, then 500. So as you can see, the scale was huge. The money was not enough for renovating all the blocks at the beginning. That's why they had to do it slowly but gradually and systematically. They renovated the blocks. And another issue that you could see during the visitation, the tours, was a big number of visitors groups. Well, each group that entered the museum had to be under the care of an employee. And these were usually guards, like wards that had to stay after work and actually show the museum. That's the picture of one of the groups together with one of the employees with a ward in a uniform, as you can see. And that's another photo with one of block in the main camp, and two pictures from Birkenau, another quite big group of people with an employee before the entrance, before the gate, the main gate to Birkenau, and another even bigger group of visitors, and a guy with his back, Tadeusz Szymański. He's now describing the story of the camp. I assume that at the beginning it was really hard to show something to the visitor, so the authority of this museum decided to make certain reconstructions, but only of those objects that were related directly to the suffering, to the death of the prisoners. So here you can see the place where the first reconstruction took place. This is a courtyard of Block 11. On the right, you can see the fragment of this block. And between Block 11 and 10, there was a brick wall. And before the wall, during the camp, the operation of the camp, it was called a black wall, where they did executions of the prisoners in front of this wall. So at the end of the 1946, they decided to reconstruct this black wall, which was then called the death wall. And here you can see this reconstruction. And they also decided to reconstruct partial reconstruction of crematorium 1, because at the end of the operation of the camp in 1944, it was actually transformed into a kind of air dry shelter. And so they wanted to bring back the original side, the original wall that was there. And so the windows were bricked. The other door was actually eliminated during the transformation time. And because it became a shelter, right? So they had to make certain changes, and then they had to bring back the original state. So you can see the reconstruction now, what it looked like after. So they also reconstructed the chimney that had been there before, and you can see now the full reconstruction of the chimney. They also reconstructed two furnaces inside block. And let me emphasize that they used the original construction materials that were not deported, that they were not actually taken away. They were actually stored in the main camp. I showed you the photo before, this Uber one, and I showed you how the bodies were stored in one of the trolleys. They also partially reconstructed the standing rooms in Block 11 and scaffolds, this group collective scaffolds, where they hang 12 prisoners in July 1944. So these were the major reconstructions. However, Tadeusz Wąsiowicz put an emphasis on not making more changes, important changes in the visual aspect, because he wanted to preserve how the camp was left, after the war. I mean, the state of the objects. He wanted to preserve this state, actually. And thanks to the solutions, they were able to preserve this original state, this original visual aspect of this blocks of this building. So it shows, authenticity.
So as for Birkenau, in the first months when the museum was created and the visitors were able to see at least some parts of the former camp for the female prisoners, the brick blocks. They could go to the ruins of crematorium number 2 and 3. I'm not sure if it concerned number 4 and 5 as well. And some places where the human ashes were damped. And here we can see the pictures of those brick blocks from the former female camp from 1943, July. Picture of the ruins of crematorium number 2, quite shocking because the visitors were actually walking on the ruins and were looking at other remnants from that perspective. And I think here we can see Tadeusz Szymański, whom I mentioned earlier, who was talking about the extermination in gas chambers. And the visitors were also shown the places where the ashes were damped. In June 1946, Tadeusz Wąsowicz, thanks to his efforts, managed to take over a lot of the property that was previously stolen from the Jews, which was still kept in those blocks we can see here. So that's, let's say, an extension of the camp. And in some of those blocks, there were some storage facilities where the property was still kept. The property was then under the control of another institution managing the post-German property called Liquidation Office, State Liquidation Office. And the Tadeusz Wąsowicz arranged with the head of the local office of this institution, and as part of the arrangement, a big part of the property was taken over. What it included, well, glasses, pots, lots of shoes, clothes, suitcases. This was all taken over and was used for exhibitions in the future museum. The organizers of the museum, the state authorities, made a decision to officially open the museum on the 14th June 1947 to commemorate the 7th anniversary of the first transport of Polish political prisoners. And during the preparations for this ceremony, where the exhibitions in several parts were prepared, the original plan was to have exhibitions in 11 blocks, plus block number 11 was also to be made available for visitors. Finally, exhibitions were made only in a few blocks due to some financial constraints. But during the preparation for the opening of the museum, there were some discussions with representatives of the organizations associating Polish Jews who wanted to participate in the organization of the museum and preparation of the exhibition. They came in May 1947, and that's an entry to the commemorative book where we have names of these delegations who came here on the 14th of May 1947 with Nathan Blumenthal, who was the head of the Central Jewish Historical Commission in Poland. There were also representatives of other institutions. There were some discussions later on, and during those discussions, representatives of the Jewish organizations made a proposal request to hand over blocks number 4 and 10 to Jewish organizations so that exhibitions could be organized there and arrange something like a museum within a museum. So the response was positive. However, the problem was that the Jewish organizations did not have enough time. So finally, the Jewish historians, Jewish artists prepared an exhibition only in one room in Block 4. I will shortly show you the Jewish exhibition in block number 4. And other parts of this exhibition. So the museum was officially opened on the 14th of June, according to the plan. And during the ceremonies, there were several dozen people, representatives of families of former prisoners, families of people who died. Here we can see a former prisoner, a prime minister at that time, Jacek Cyrankiewicz, and on the right we have Tadeusz Wąsowicz, the director of this museum. So the agenda included religious ceremonies for different denominations. There was a Catholic mass in the courtyard of Block 11, and in Block 4 there was a Jewish ceremony. And then there were speeches by the guests. Here you can see how many people attended those ceremonies. There are flags of different organizations who came here, and we can see Tadeusz Cyrankiewicz giving a speech. Then wreaths were placed in the courtyard of Block 11, and Jacek Cyrankiewicz announced the museum open. And then the delegates went to Birkenau, where they paid tribute to the people killed in Birkenau camp. And then it was possible to see the exhibitions. There was also a temporary guidebook in the museum. There were some postcards sold, and the income was spent on the functioning of the museum. There were plans to hold exhibitions from blocks 4 to 10 plus block number 11 to as a mausoleum, and then block 15 to 18. But finally, in fact, the exhibitions were only in blocks 4, 5, 8, and 9. In block 4, on the ground floor, in the second part of 1946, a first, let's say, mini exhibition was organized. It was available to the visitors all the time. So this was an attempt to underline what groups of people were brought here to Auschwitz, what groups of people were killed here. So in those, there were showcases surrounded with barbed wire, with crutches, children clothes, female hair, clothes, characteristics for peasants, for Highlanders, for Jews from Central and Eastern Europe, clothes, characteristics for workers. And in the background, there was an urn with the ashes of the killed people, plus a cross, which was a symbol of suffering. And then in one of the rooms, there was an exhibition prepared by artists and historians of Jewish origin. And in the central part of this room, there was this centerpiece, sarcophagus, with the candlelight, and over we have a white dove symbolizing the souls of the killed people, murdered people. And on the opposite wall, there was an urn with the ashes of the murdered people, and next to it there were pictures of a former Jewish female, Ella Shiberman, and pictures or drawings of the Soviet soldier I mentioned before, Zenohi Tokachev. So the pictures or drawings made by Ella Shiber are visible here on the left side. I will show you two of them. They are called Selection in the Female Camp and the Roll Call in the Female Camp, plus two pictures out of four in the exhibition made by Zenobi Tokachev, Cyclone B, and Flowers in the Snow. There were also all kinds of documents delivered by the Jewish historians showing or documenting the extermination of Jews in Auschwitz. And what I wanted to underline here is that at that time, it was the only exhibition that we could call a national exhibition. It was not a Polish exhibition, Soviet exhibition, it was Jewish exhibition. So what was also available to see in other blocks? Well, in block number 4, there were the containers of Cyclone B and the granules not active anymore. And there was also a big showcase, including 2 tons of female hair coming from women killed, murdered in Auschwitz. So the samples taken, the analysis of the samples taken showed that they contained the remains of cyanide hydrogen. And in blocks 4, 5, and 6, called Canada, I don't have to explain that name anymore, it was possible to see all the elements that a year before were taken over by Tadeusz von Sowicz from the blocks in the extended part of the camp. And there in block 5 and 6, you could see Jewish religious clothes, crutches, animal pots, enormous amounts of shoes and clothes. Well, actually, one room was filled with clothes only. There were also all kinds of brushes, and in one of the rooms, for contrast, there were only a few pieces of children clothes, which, according to the press, made a big impression. And in other rooms, there were all kinds of cutlery items, knives, and in the background we can see some containers, cream containers, and suitcases with transport numbers and personal data of the people who were deported to Auschwitz. So the exhibition was received positively by Polish press and the Jewish press, the Jewish community. So around 2 weeks after opening the museum, the Polish parliament adopted a resolution about commemoration of the martyrdom of the Polish nation and other nations in Auschwitz. which also established officially this museum. This situation was quite untypical. First, there was an actual opening of the institution, and the legal framework was adopted later. But I think it happened because there was a plan to open the museum on the 14th of June, and the parliament was scheduled to meet at the beginning of July, and probably that's why the situation is so untypical. So in Article 1 of this act of July 2nd, 1947, we can read that the area of the former Nazi camp in Oświęcim, along with all the buildings and equipment located there, is to remain as the monument to the martyrdom of the Polish nation and other nations. There were plans to finish preparing the exhibitions that were not ready for the opening of the museum. And there were actually two committees, historical one and art one, whose task was to prepare those exhibitions. However, the works were postponed because starting from 1948, in Poland, let's say, was the beginning of the Stalin era, which was characterized by the fact that all kinds of institutions, organizations, cultural life, economic life was subordinated to the Communist Party. And before, the employees of the museum had full freedom in their actions, but starting from 1948, 49, they were actually losing this freedom. And in 1950, there was a complete change in the exhibitions. It was all subordinated to the communist ideology. The Jewish exhibition in block number 4 was removed, and the proposal of the Jewish community to give them block 4 and block 10 was never materialized. So those plans were only fulfilled partly, and well, this is evidenced by the Jewish exhibition in block number 27. But before the Stalin era started, the Jewish community achieved some sort of success, because in April 1945, thanks to their efforts, a monument was opened. It was the first one in the former camp area. It's, let's say, a memory monument. We can see it in the upper picture, and in those 3 columns in Polish, Yiddish, and in Hebrew, the memory of Jews who were killed here was commemorated. So this monument was located close to the ruins of crematorium number 2. So if you take a closer look on the picture in the bottom, the monument is there. It was removed in 1946 or 7 when the big monument to the victims of the camp was built. It was actually launched in April 1947. So I think my time is coming to an end. I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And a proposal from my side. I know that my colleague Piotr Setkiewicz will have his presentation soon. So if you have any questions, anything you would like to ask, please email me. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. So surely we could continue and keep talking about how the exhibition changed. I mean, the permanent exhibition and the national exhibitions, the Polish one, the Jewish ones, and the other ones created in the following years. So thank you for this lecture today. As for email address to Mr. Jacek Lachendro, I will make it available in the chat box if you want to ask any questions. And now I would like to suggest a short break. We'll meet again at 5:45 to listen to the lecture of Piotr Setkiewicz. So see you in 13 minutes.